the questions that we'll be wrestling with today is how might or should we shape the future? I'm a futurist, let me just say that. My work is phenomenology and looking at the phenomena of thinking and doing around issues of the future. So how has artificial intelligence and religion interfaced with the past, for better or worse? What promise and perils might the future hold for their continuing connection? And what should our role be in shaping that future, or the future we imagine?
So first of all, I think it's important to say that when we think about something like the formation of the British Royal Academy, they understood the work that they were doing explicitly in religious terms, because they thought that their task was to bring humanity back to its state as Adam in the garden, who knew everything, and then also to work with the earth to bring it back to a condition called paradise. So the academy was formed very much within a theologically, scripturally informed ethos in service of a religious project, you might say. But of course, what we know is that it doesn't take very long for the criticisms of religion to emerge, so that we no longer have trust in the authority of clerical people. And so religion becomes a problem for science. And religion is viewed to be something like an impediment to the work of technological advancement. But then what happens even further on is that some of the technological prophets, we might call them, take on a sort of religious character, so that you have science now acting as a kind of religion that has its prophets, it has its scriptures, it has its vision of salvation, it even has a vision of the goal of human life called eschatology in theological circles. So I just want you to be aware of that, because it's very interesting that science has this relationship with religion that changes significantly over time. And I think it's an open question what the relationship between these two might be at this particular juncture and what it might be going forward. So that's just a prefatory comment. Now let's talk a little bit about what do we think technology is trying to do. And I think in general terms, we could say that technology is in the service of improving the human condition. Right? That's something that we find stated quite early, and it's stated in many continuing forms. And if we're going to talk about technology as improving the human condition, first of all, it's very hard to argue against that. Right? How would we say that we're opposed to improving the human condition? So I think for me, one of the real questions then is, what does it mean to improve? And what do we understand the human to be, such that we can say that we have done both, improved and enabled a human condition to flourish in ways that it had not before? And so that's one of the questions I want us to be talking about with each other tonight. What do we understand the human to be? And what would be the measure by which we could say their lives have been improved? And the reason I want us to talk about that is I think we don't talk about that nearly enough. Right? I would ask you, where in the course of your disciplinary formation, in your research programs, do you have occasion to stop and ask the question, why are we doing this? How is it going to make things better? How is it going to make life better? How is it going to make human life better? And I don't doubt for a minute, okay, I want to be clear, I'm not a Luddite in the sense that I'm opposed to all technological development. That's not at all the case. But I want to ask the question about whether or not the technological development that has become so pervasive, right, has not thought carefully about this issue. So that's one question I want us to have on the table. A second one, which I think is also very important, is that the effort to improve the human condition has gone hand in hand with the effort to engineer the world to facilitate such improvement. Now, the reason I think we need to have both of those questions together is because we can look at what the state of our planet is as a barometer to see whether or not the technological development we've been espousing is doing the very thing it's been promising. Because as I read it, and I know we can talk about this because there will be different ways to read, obviously, As I read it, so much of human technological development has been in the service of controlling nature, has been in the service of controlling life. And this has taken many, many forms. But one of the questions I want us to be thinking about together is, what does the ambition to control the world already say about what we understand a human being to be? And I have in mind here some work by a German sociologist by the name of Hartmut Rosa, who has written this fabulous, very big book called Resonance, which is a theory about modernity. And in this book, he says that the human effort to control life, to control the world, has had the effect of rendering that world mute. And what he means by that is the effort to control the world means we first have to objectify the world. And that means also objectify human relationships, objectify humans. And he says this has become a very dangerous enterprise because it has built into it all sorts of mechanisms that are very familiar to us living in this modern, postmodern world. We can talk about acceleration, social acceleration. We can talk about optimization, because these are defining features of our time. We're all in the business of trying to optimize every opportunity that we can. You don't come to a place like Duke or Stanford if you're not committed to this effort. But the question is, when we try to optimize, and we mean by optimizing things like controlling, or another way to put this is bringing the world to our availability, right? So the fact that we all have one of these guys is incredible, right? Because with that phone, we can literally have the whole world at our fingertips. We can access information, we can access services, we can access commodities. And if you've got a credit card, you can have them delivered to your door the very next day. That's what technological development has done in the ways of just ordinary life for ordinary people. That's incredible. And the question I want us to ask is, has it made us happier? And we have to ask that question because when we ask, has all of this technological development made us happier? What that does is it raises the question again, what's a human life and what's a human life for? How will we know that that human life has been improved? Because by virtually any measure, the lives of us in this room are so much better, in quotation marks, than the lives of even kings and queens 100 years ago. Right? They could not imagine the kinds of things we're able to do and have. And yet, it's not enough. We're still committed to optimization. Because, mine's just an iPhone 11. I'm so out of date. Right? And we're in this perpetual wanting more, faster, more having. And it means that we're not settled at all about what we consider to be human happiness, human fulfillment. So it seems like the effort to improve has done a lot of things, but there's a lot of things that we're not taking into account because we're still not happy. And then when we apply this question about improvement to the world in which human beings live, we know the problems are severe. Right? We're rendering many places of this world not just inhospitable to multi-species life, but uninhabitable for multi-species life. So the question is, if we're living in a world that is uniquely, finely tuned to human life, along with the lives of gazillion other life forms, and we're doing so much damage to it in the name of fulfillment, there's got to be something wrong in the vision. And I'm not saying the whole vision is wrong, right? I'm not wanting to go back to a world before antibiotics, maybe a world before antibiotics used in animal feeds, but we're not wanting to go backward. The question is, where do we have occasion to talk about the measures of improvement? because it seems like technological development has this built-in idea of limitlessness. And if we can't talk about limits, do we lose the possibility of even talking about what a human form is? And I think this is a crucially important question to ask, because if we cannot talk about limits to what we understand human potential might be, but also limits to what we think human improvement might be, we're going to be in a really tough bind going forward, because the desire for limitlessness is doing so much damage to the places of this world and to the many creatures, humans included, that live in them. Right? And then the last thing I want to bring up before Daniel can get it in his comments is, when we're talking about certain forms of technological development, it's important to understand that technological devices, technological media, they're never philosophically neutral. Right? There was a time when we talked about tools as just being, they're just devices. But what we've clearly begun to see is that technological devices always encode a philosophical position, which already assumes something about the kinds of humans we are. Right? And it's no accident that neoliberal ways of thinking today are so dominant in the technological innovation space. And this neoliberal way of thinking assumes people to be, first and foremost, individuals. Now, this is a serious problem, because any way that I think about intelligence, whether it's artificial or not, intelligence is deeply social, and it's also deeply ecological. Because for us to think, we never simply think with our individual brains. We think with others, because others have shaped our thinking from the beginning. And thinking then becomes this social enterprise, which is an amalgamation, right, of sensation, sympathy, fellow feeling, passions, vulnerabilities, fears. All of these things are absolutely vital to the way we think about intelligence. And then secondly, intelligence is always deeply ecological, right? What you think is a feature of your own embodiment in its relationship to all the other plant, animal, insect, microbial bodies that are constantly traveling through our bodies, and we are constantly engaging in our day-to-day activities. So if we don't pay attention to these ecological and social dimensions to intelligence, have we done a great disservice to human beings? And I think we have. Because when we think about something like the metaverse, which is much trumpeted by Zuckerberg, and I don't have a big opinion on the metaverse, but it clearly encodes already a deep philosophical commitment to what we think a human being is, which is primarily a shopper. Right? One of the reasons the metaverse is so attractive, and I know metaverse can have some wonderful applications, but one of the things that's so attractive about metaverse is to corporations, it means you now have to completely do virtual accessorizing. So you may have your Gucci handbag, but now you got to have your virtual Gucci handbag too. And Gucci loves the idea of being able to sell you virtual. But everybody in the corporate world would like nothing more than for you to buy the virtual analog to the real thing. And this, of course, is a very sinister reading, but I'm thoroughly inclined to say that this is not just my sinister reading. It's just the way the world works. One of the reasons the metaverse is so attractive to so many people is because there's so much money to be made. And the reason I worry about that is because we can now live in a virtual coral reef and just let the real coral reef, the Great Barrier Reef, die. And when it dies, we're in real trouble, not just virtual trouble. So I'll stop there.
I'm very much not an expert on the topic. And so, I've never given a presentation to so many professors on a topic that I know so little about. But, and everything I'm saying is coming from the point of view of somebody, just my own personal, thoughts, I guess, on the topic. So, as a Jew and as a person who thinks a lot about the meaning of Judaism, I engage with it in many ways through the text. That's way of thinking that is comfortable for me as a scholar and as a person. And so I thought we'd talk a little bit about the text. And when doing that, it's good to begin, in the beginning. Bereshit, in the beginning of Genesis. If I had assigned reading, I would have assigned Genesis 1 and 2. And so it says here, Vayomer Elohim na'aseh Adam b'altzalmenu kidmotenu v'yirdu beit gam chayam, etc., etc. So, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and they shall rule over the fish of the sea, etc. So a bunch of powerful things that man should be able to do, right? And of course, a really key aspect of this is this term, b'tzalmenu kidmotenu, in our image, after our likeness. This is the first time man comes up. The first 25 verses of Genesis are about a bunch of other stuff, creating the world and all that. Man comes in here, and the very first thing that's said is that God is making man in his image. And that's one of the main things that is said, and it's repeated again, right? So, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam, b'tzalmo b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar v'nekva bara otam. So what that basically is saying, right, is God created man in his image, b'tzalmo. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. And so, this kind of resonant, repeated language, this is like the core or example of biblical language, is around this repeated, b'tzalmo, b'tzelem, that cadence. The thought here is not necessarily repeated throughout the rest of the Bible, but the cadence is. And this really sets a tone for how, when the Bible wants to say something and really mean it, it says it like this, twice, right in a row, right? So, I've been reading that for years, decades. And it's always made me wonder, especially as somebody who works in artificial intelligence, about the following logical syllogism. So God created humanity in his image, and at least but some of his powers, right? God is a creator. So perhaps humanity has some of the power of creation. Now, of course, humanity at any given time hasn't learned everything. So maybe it's really a power, I guess I have to stay closer to this thing, of learning how to create, right? And I guess that there's a question about what those powers are. And I realize I don't have the thing in front of me, but there's a question here. What do AI, machine learning, and big data presuppose about the nature of being human? And for me, a big question is, what does God and what does the Bible presuppose about the nature of being human? So, putting aside what the Bible says and thinking about it from that point of view of my science test hat for a second, I think, and this is my professional opinion for what it's worth, that's at least 50% certain that human-created AI will achieve all or most of the intellectual capacity, but also the performative emotional behaviors of biological humans within 50 years. And I think there's a non-zero chance it could happen substantially sooner. And so I think it's not just perhaps, but I think probably humanity has the power of creation. God must have known that would happen, right? This is not this is something that must have been fairly obvious. So at least from the Genesis 1 perspective, my reading, this is my own very limited reading, is that nothing suggests in Genesis 1 suggests that God is not a techno-optimist in some basic way. Okay? Of course, things change shortly after this. So in Genesis 11, you may be familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel, right? And this is the core story of, it's often interpreted as the core story of human hubris, technological hubris in a way, right? And there's a lot that can be said about this. There's an interesting thing going on in today's internet where people who have great knowledge put their thoughts out on Twitter about these things. There's a great thread by Ari Lamb, who's a rabbi at JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, and he has a different interpretation of the Tower of Babel story than the typical, which is, humans were cut down to size because they were getting too close to being godlike. His view, through various textual analysis that I only partially follow, is actually that God was really worried about Babel, not because of the fact of the technological prowess of humans, but because of the fact that the text implies, to some extent at least, that it was being done with forced labor, right? And so there's at least some reasonable view that the problem there is that God is not worrying so much about Babel's technological prowess. He's worried about that the society is built on injustice, right? And of course, technology can be deeply intertwined with injustice, as like basically any reasonable person thinking about the topic is going to come to. But the exact reason why matters. Is it the technology that's the problem? Is it the coming together that matters? Is it moving higher that's the problem? Or is it that when doing so, you have to be able to, with the powers of creation, be able to handle the responsibility? I think it's unclear, but at least it's one scholar's interpretation that we shouldn't think of this as basically being, an Icarus moment in either. It's possible. I just wanted to leave off with one last line of thought, which is that in Genesis 2, which comes right after Genesis 1, there's a really interesting statement. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et Adam afar min ha'adama v'yichpach ba'av nishbat chayam v'chayei ha'adam lenefesh chaya. Okay, so the things I want to focus on here is nishmat chayim, the soul of life, and nefesh chaya, become a living soul, right? So this is right after Genesis 1. It comes after as if Genesis 1 wasn't there. And it talks about like the formation of man and the fact that there's this special thing that is imparted to him through the nishmat chayim, through the breath of life, sometimes translated as the soul of life. And that's required for him to have a soul, or for humanity to have a soul. Right? And there's a lot of questions you can ask. Why is there this second account of man's creation right after the first one? Why does it seem different? I mean, there's many different routes to it. I mean, some people talk about there being the difference between the ideal and the actual. There's a convincing account that there's actually two sources, well, several sources in the Hebrew Bible, but two different sources, the priestly source and the Yahwist source, responsible for these two different chapters. But I think it's really important because regardless of how you come to the explanation for why this other version of it is there, okay, I think it's necessarily present in the narrative that there's something now special beyond intellectual capacity, right? Genesis 1, the image of God talks all about the powers that man will have over the earth. But now there's something special that's different that, I think certainly the Western tradition, the Abrahamic traditions, always have implicit in them that there's some special spark that man means something beyond just those intellectual capacity or behaviors, essentially. And I don't know whether or not this is something that we can build. I don't know if it's inevitable or not. I think that's a big question. It's a big question for everybody, including AI folks. And if it were true, would we be able to accept it? I think that's the biggest question, because one of the worries that I have is that we will be unjust to our creations. Thank you for listening to my textual exegesis. Yeah.
Can a machine be programmed to have a spirit? Can a machine, this really brings our topics together, yes, be programmed to have a spirit? What's the possibility of that? I know.
I think the question is, how would we know? That's all I know to say on that.
For me, the question is, what do you mean by the word spirit? Because in various traditions, the language of spirit is precisely something that is not within us, but is something we participate in. Right? So having the spirit would suggest that it's containable within us. Whereas in many of the traditions that I know of, spirit is something that we can't contain, but we always move within. And that's especially if you think of spirit as sort of the animating power of life, or whatever way that you might use that word. But
so then, can the machines move within that society?
That's a great question. I don't know enough about machines to be able to answer that, yeah.
I think it's going to be hard to tell the boundary. And that's there. Then we're going to be faced with the question of what to make of that.
Yeah.
Now we want to hear your closing remarks.
Well, my closing remark is that I wish I could have been at your tables to hear how you all talked about this, because the reason I think this is such an important question is, as I said, I don't think we talk about it enough in the varying forms of work that we do, which is this question: what do we think a human being is, and what's a human life for? I'm not presupposing that we're going to come to one answer, and I'm not trying to legislate what that answer would be. I just want us to have that conversation, because I think, especially when we have that conversation with a wide diversity of people, we discover that there isn't one answer, and we also discover that we bring different perspectives that will often challenge the varying assumptions that we might have ourselves. So I, for instance, have learned so much from Indigenous people that I've engaged in conversation about this question, because their understanding of the world and a human life is so different than the one I grew up with. And that has important implications then for what we think, well, what is the goal of improving a human life when we have these different views of what a human being is? And I think that's an important question that we need to ask.
Oh, well, okay, so I didn't prepare any closing remarks, but in thinking about it, I started in Reshid at the beginning, and I feel like, thinking symmetrically, toward the end of the Torah, there's an interesting scene where Moses, sort of contradictorily, since he supposedly wrote the 5 books, but anyway, was seeing over into the Promised Land, and was told that he would never get there, but that seeing that possibility was enough. And I think we're at an interesting moment now where we see the possibility that we may transcend limits that we for millennia, however long, thought were there. And I don't know if we'll see it, but it's a lot for us to take in. And I think that it's worth enjoying that in a certain way too.